I'm Christoper Conover. I'm a reporter at Arizona Public Media, NPR 89.1, also host of The Buzz. And here we are, less than a day out from Election Day. Joining me for the next hour for this All Eyes on Arizona discussion is Samara Klar. She's an assistant professor at the University of Arizona's School of Government and Public Policy in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Samara, thanks so much for joining us. I think in some ways you and I talk to each other all the time. All these 100+ people who are watching just now get a front row seat to one of our conversations.
Yeah, these days I feel like I talk to you more often than many of my friends and family, but it's great to speak with you again. This has been a really busy and really crazy campaign.
It has been busy and crazy, and it is a little hard to believe that tomorrow is it for the voting portion of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, we've been voting for quite some time here in Arizona, and they start counting ballots early here in Arizona, so it is possible that tomorrow night we'll have some indication of how Arizona is voting this year in 2020. I would say we probably still should give it a few extra days, but it looks like the end is definitely near, and soon this may all be over. We may have some resolution as to what's going on.
Exactly. Let's talk about something everybody talks about all the time during these elections is polls. I saw new polls coming out this morning. In the last week, maybe 2 weeks, we've seen those polls getting tighter here in Arizona and other places. Is that any surprise?
You know, the polls in Arizona for months now have really been within the margin of error at the presidential level. We can talk about the Senate separately, but when we're looking at Trump and Biden here in Arizona, it's just anyone's guess. I tend to see Biden in the lead a little more often than Trump, but again, almost every poll that I'm seeing is within the margin of error, which means that we really just can't say statistically who is ahead. Now, when polls tighten within the margin of error, we can't even really say they're tightening because there's no significant shift there. All we know is that the two candidates right now are really neck and neck, and every vote makes a difference in this state because it is just such a true toss-up.
It is. And Arizona, people keep talking about Arizona going purple, Arizona going purple. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you've written some on this. Is Arizona going purple?
Well, I think Arizona's been going purple for quite a long time. I don't think, around the country and even around the world have a few misconceptions about the state of Arizona. One of those is that Arizona is this really deep red state where Republicans tend to win by big, big landslides. That's not actually the case. If you look over the past several decades, Republicans consistently win Arizona, but they usually get about 50, 55, 56% of the vote. I mean, I think even John McCain got 53, 54% of the vote in Arizona. So this really has never been a state where Republicans are winning by these massive double-digit landslides. Now, instead, what we find is that it's a fairly moderate state. There's more Republicans than there are Democrats, and that is true today. But, generally, the demographics of the electorate have been shifting leftward. So over time in Arizona, we see a greater proportion of the electorate who are Latino, a greater proportion of the electorate who have college degrees. Arizona is really rapidly urbanizing, so more and more people are living in the cities. Phoenix is a huge city, fifth largest city in the United States. So all of these trends favor the Democratic Party. So what we're seeing this year isn't really an aberration or an anomaly. I think it's sort of the natural progression of the electoral trends in Arizona over time.
For those of you just joining us, I see that number is creeping up towards 130. Let me just reintroduce us. My name is Christoper Conover. I'm a reporter and show host at NPR 89.1, Arizona Public Media. Samara Klar is an associate professor at the School of Government and Public Policy within the College of Social and Behavioral Science. And we're talking about, what are we talking about? Oh, the election. Who knew?
Right, I forgot.
Here we are.
Talking about the weather.
Exactly.
Beautiful.
As you said, Republicans have dominated Arizona registration number-wise.
That's right.
For years, but we have this interesting no-party affiliate registration. In 2010, no party passed Democrats, putting Democrats in third place. This year, for the first time in a decade, Democrats jumped back over no party, by a whopping 20,000 votes.
Right.
So when it comes to predicting anything about tomorrow or any election, those no party voters really play an interesting role.
Yeah, here in Arizona, you have to register with a party in order to participate in the primary. And something we saw this year was a really big interest among Arizonans in participating in that Democratic primary. So we saw a huge increase over the summer in the number of Arizonans registering as Democrats. We've also seen an increase of Arizonans registering as Republicans, and they maintain a numerical majority here in Arizona. But there has been a growing proportion of Arizonans who identify as Democrat. I believe it's around 41, 42% now, compared to about 45, 46% of Arizonans who say they're Republican. And the remainder, about almost a third, between 20% and a third, identify as independent. Now, the polling that I've seen suggests that independents favor Biden, which is huge for him. And I think part of the reason he is overperforming, given the number of Democrats we have in the state. And if those independents show up at the polls, then Biden could see a victory, and Arizona could vote for a Democrat for president for the first time since Bill Clinton.
You and your colleague Christopher Weber at the school have done some surveying, published something in the New York Times just about a month ago about what Arizona voters are, who they are, and they're not those hard partisans that we necessarily see in other parts of the country.
Yeah, that's right. Through the Arizona Policy Lab, we did a big survey of about 1,100 Arizonans. And we wanted to not only ask who they're voting for, but sort of what they think about politics, what they think about the big political issues. And what we found is that all voters here in Arizona, Democrats and Republicans, are really quite moderate. And when I say that is, first of all, they view themselves as moderate, they perceive themselves as moderate, which is important in and of itself. But above and beyond that, they hold a really interesting mix of policy preferences. So Republicans here in Arizona are actually not really aligned with Trump on several key issues. Probably the most important one these days is coronavirus. We found that most Republicans in Arizona believe that masks should be mandated. Over 80% of Republicans in Arizona say that they are often or always wearing a mask when they go outside. These are behaviors and policies that Trump has really refused to publicly endorse. And when you look on TV or on social media, you might find a lot of images of these Trump rallies and no one's wearing masks. And I think our polling suggests that's really a small minority of Republicans. The vast majority of Republicans here, and certainly more Democrats in Arizona, aren't particularly happy with how Trump has handled coronavirus, especially when it comes to policies like that. In fact, where we saw really broad support among Republicans and Democrats was for mayors. Arizonans are really happy with how their mayors have handled coronavirus. And I think largely that's because the mayors are the ones who've been left to implement a lot of these precautionary policies that people really do support.
You also, in that survey, found some interesting things, I thought, when I was looking through it, about the immigration and the border.
Yeah.
Keep in mind that Arizona is a border state, and it's just down the road from those of us in Tucson.
Yeah, immigration is an area where neither Democrats nor Republicans fully align with their party in sort of interesting ways. Among Republicans, what we found is that a majority believe that immigrants who arrived here as undocumented kids should have a path to citizenship. That's a program that Trump has actually tried to dismantle multiple times. Most Republicans in Arizona told us they think immigrants help help the economy of the state. Most Republicans in Arizona told us that they think immigrants help the culture of the state. So the sort of anti-immigrant rhetoric that's coming out of the National Republican Party really doesn't align with how most Republicans in Arizona think about the issue. And we also found some interesting discrepancies among Democrats. So among Democrats in Arizona, about a fifth or 20% or so support a border wall along the US-Mexico border. Now, 20% isn't a majority, but it's still sizable given that Biden has said he will immediately dismantle the border, or at least halt the progress that Trump has made. So immigration is a big issue here, and it's one where I think both parties have reason to be unsatisfied with what they're seeing in Washington.
And looking at that survey and then a set of elections that doesn't get a lot of talk, the legislature, the state leaders, people view them differently than they view, be it the Senate or the presidential race.
Yeah, Arizonans view their own state leaders as much more moderate than what they see nationally. Now, and that's particularly true when they're looking at Democrats. So one of the interesting takeaways from the survey is that Democrats and Republicans are particularly likely to view Democrats in our state as more moderate. And I think this really speaks to the effective campaigning Democrats here have done in trying to convey themselves as centrists. Now, we saw Kristen Sinema do this really well in 2018. She ran a very moderate platform, and she has really successfully upheld her image as a centrist. And for that reason, she is still quite popular in Arizona. Many people are saying that Mark Kelly has really followed that playbook to a T, and it's really working out for him. Mark Kelly is seen as very centrist, as very moderate. He describes himself as an independent thinker, and Arizonans love independent thinkers. That is just sort of what defines the sort of zeitgeist of Arizona's voters over decades now. Arizonans always sort of reward the candidates who put forward more of a moderate image. Mark Kelly is really successful, and I think that's what's hurting Martha McSally. She's having a hard time convincing voters that she's moderate, partially given the fact that she's so tied to Donald Trump, and that seems to really be hurting her in the polls.
And in that seat in particular, now we have a history of independence. Mark Kelly and Martha McSally are trying to finish out John McCain's term, and he was independent. That is for sure. President Trump is still angry with him over the thumbs down. That still shows up. So that's an independent seat in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, we saw, for those who caught the senatorial debate, that was an awkward moment for Martha McSally. When she was asked to talk about Donald Trump's attitude toward John McCain, when she was asked to talk about her own relationship with Donald Trump, she has said that, she was really angered by the way Donald Trump spoke of Senator McCain. But at the same time, she's been really closely tied with him. And when asked whether she was proud of her relationship with Donald Trump, it was sort of awkward how she kind of tried to dodge that question. So, McSally knows that her relationship with Trump is not necessarily helping her here in the state. And I don't think Trump's really benefiting from it either, because McSally's approval rating in Arizona is actually lower than Trump's.
Let's talk a little bit going back to voter registration numbers and turnout. We saw big turnout, especially from Democrats in the primary back in August. It seems so long ago, yet it only seems like yesterday at other times. Can we learn anything from primary turnout and primary registration this year?
Yeah, I think so. We saw huge enthusiasm over the summer, especially among, this increase in voters registering as Democrats. And I think that's really translated when we look at early voting. Early voting in Arizona has been absolutely huge. It's always big. Arizonans love to vote by mail. In 2016, 78% of Arizonans voted by mail. And there was no pandemic then. That's just how Arizonans like to vote. So I think we already knew it was going to be really big this year. I don't think what people quite anticipated was the massive turnout. I mean, we are seeing, as of, I think what I read today, 90% of everyone who voted in 2016 has already voted early in Maricopa County. So, our turnout record is going to be absolutely smashed this year. And that largely was sort of predicated by the big numbers in registration we saw over the summer.
Yeah, overall, we're at 70% of people have already cast their ballots. I think we are getting close to equal to the statewide number from 16. I mean, it's people are throwing ballots into ballot boxes all over the place really quickly right now.
I mean, the mobilization efforts in Arizona have been huge. I read this morning that Biden has spent more money in Maricopa County than he has in any other county for advertisements. So there's been tons of ads, people going door to door, even in the pandemic. I mean, I live in Midtown Tucson, so we get people with masks and face shields knocking on our door, giving us flyers. I had to put up a sign asking people to stop ringing the doorbell because of the kids. So, it's been a huge get out the vote movement in Arizona. And I think the Democrats see the Senate seat in particular as super valuable. And the Republicans realize that they're going to have to work triple time to try to defend it.
It's interesting looking at the returns this year. I didn't see returns from the weekend, but on Friday, Democrats were outnumbering Republicans on early votes, but there's still a lot of votes that haven't come in. So people are expecting a flood of Republican votes tomorrow. Again, can we read anything into early balloting results, especially with that little independent streak that Arizona tends to have?
Well, what we've seen pretty consistently across the country is that Democrats are saying that they're more likely to vote by mail or vote early, and Republicans are more likely to say that they are going to show up on election day. So, I think across the country, we're seeing this pattern where early votes tend to be overrepresented by Democrats. Here in Arizona, what that means is that the first ballots that they're counting over the last 2 weeks will probably be more in favor of Biden than what we're going to see ultimately. And so it's just going to depend on how many Republicans actually show up tomorrow to, figure out what that final balance is.
And as you said, we in Arizona have voted so long by mail. I know I've had colleagues from across the country emailing me and calling me saying, what is it with you people in mail-in and what are the problems? And I say, there aren't large problems. We've been doing this for a while. We've got it figured out.
And I think that's an area where Governor Doug Ducey, who, has been saying pretty clearly that we can trust the mail-in system. We don't have to worry about the integrity of the election. Arizona's done it right before and we'll do it right again. But I think Arizonans should remember in 2018, it was a midterm election, high turnout for a midterm, but a midterm nonetheless. And it still took, 6 days to figure out who finally won. You probably remember more vividly than I do because you were probably reporting every single day of it. But, given that was a midterm and we still needed almost a week, I'm telling my friends and family, just go to bed on Tuesday night, get some rest. There's no sense in staying up all night because who knows whether we're going to get the numbers by the morning.
Well, and Arizona law sets that up. The counties have 20 days to certify the vote. So they have a lot of time to count. And then the Secretary of State has another 10 days after that. There's a little buffer built in. So it allows for that slower vote. I know talking to the county recorder here in Pima County and some of the other counties, they said, yeah, we're going to go slow. We have to sort any of those mail-in ballots that people didn't mail in and drop off tomorrow. They have to go through the same process. We have to check the signatures and all of that. So it takes time.
Yeah.
But Arizonans seem a little more accepting of it. This year, they might not be. People want the answer, but
well, there's so much anxiety and so much enthusiasm about this election. One of the polling numbers that was really striking to me is quite early on, it was just a handful of Democrats and Republicans who said they would ever consider voting for the candidate from the other party. So, these are two candidates who are very distinct. People know who they are. Neither of them are unknowns. They're both very well known. Probably both of them are better known than many people wish they were at this point. So people have decided, we've talked about this before, the percentage of undecideds at this point is very, very small. People know what they're getting in for, and they're just anxious for it to be over, I think.
Talking about enthusiasm, we certainly have seen enthusiasm for these two candidates, but I've also seen bumper stickers that say, any functioning adult 2020 and fine with Biden, which
Sure.
does not bring up a lot of enthusiasm as I think about it. Is this a case where maybe on both sides, even supporters of President Trump, they're not so much voting for the candidate as voting against the other candidate? They're afraid of the other candidate.
Yeah, a really sort of increasingly common topic that we talk about in political science is the idea of negative partisanship, which means that you're not necessarily supporting your own candidate or even your own party's policies as much as you are expressing your opposition against the other side's candidate or the other side's policies. And I think we are seeing a lot of that. That has really been increasing. Biden was in a big field in the primaries. There were 24 Democratic nominees
Something
in the
like,
primaries,
yeah,
something
it was
like that.
huge.
So, a lot of people didn't vote for him. And that's just the way it is when you've got a lot of nominees. Trump was in the same situation in 2016 now. So, there are going to be plenty of voters who did not support Biden in the primary. But I think what's different this time around relative to 2016 is that Democrats have much stronger views on Trump than they did in 2016. Of course, Democrats were opposed to Trump in 2016, but he was still unknown relatively. His policies weren't really known. Some people speculated that he might end up being a little more moderate than we all would expect, given that he didn't really have much experience in politics or even much of a track record or even really much of a voting record to go off of. Now in 2020, Democrats know exactly who he is. They're familiar with his policies. And it's much easier, I think, for Democrats to rally around this idea of negative partisanship, for Democrats to say, you know what, Biden might not have been my first choice, but Trump is still in office and that's who I'm voting against. And of course, we see the same thing among Republicans. Trump has absolutely lost enthusiasm, or voters have lost enthusiasm for Trump. Here in Arizona, his approval has declined precipitously since Inauguration Day. But there's also Republicans out there who have particular issues that are important to them. Abortion is a big issue for many Republicans, for example. They may not respect Trump all that much. They may not like him that much. But the fact is, they've got two candidates to choose from. And so we will see voters from both parties who are essentially supporting their party only to oppose the other one.
Now, 4 years ago at this time, a lot of people were talking about it's a slam dunk for Hillary Clinton. All the polls were leading, had Clinton in the lead. I know on election night, I was at the Pima County Republican Party, and the mood early in the night, it was a funeral.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, the whole thing changed and everyone said, see, the polls were wrong, Trump, and we all know what happened. Can people trust the polls this year? And have pollsters learned anything over the last 4 years?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think pollsters have spent more time than you could imagine going over what happened in 2016. What I will say is, first of all, the national popular vote predictions in 2016 were pretty much dead on. So most pollsters predicted that Hillary Clinton would win by about, somewhere between 2 to 4 percentage points. And she ended up winning the national popular vote by just under 2 percentage points, I believe. So that's within the margin of error. And that's actually more accurate than what we've had in recent elections. So if you want to look at the national popular vote in 2016, the polls were very, very accurate. And we could expect that they'll be similarly accurate this year. What went wrong in 2016 was scarce and not in terribly accurate polling at the state level. But even then, I will say that the states that really came as a big shock to everyone, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Trump won so narrowly by less than a percentage point that in fact what the pollsters had predicted was not all that different. It was just a couple percentage points off, but in the opposite direction. Now, there was a few things that went wrong with state polling. I think the biggest flaw that is most frequently discussed, the fact that pollsters in 2016, looking within states, were not weighting by education. So what that means is, when these polls are being administered, the sample is not a perfectly representative sample of the United States. And that's for a lot of reasons. First of all, those sampling techniques are incredibly expensive, so not everyone uses them. But even when you do try to go for probability sampling, there's always certain kinds of people who are much more likely to participate in polls. College-educated people and Democrats tend to be a little more likely to participate in polls. So the way that survey researchers account for that is by weighting the data. So allowing certain responses to count for a little bit more to make up for the fact that those respondents were less likely to participate in the survey. Now, one demographic upon which survey researchers did not weight in this 2016 state polls was education. Typically, education hasn't been a big determinant of votes, but over the past several years, particularly among white voters, education has become extremely determinant of how people vote, with higher educated individuals being much more likely to support the Democratic Party. So what happened in 2016 at the state level was there's a lot of highly educated people participating in surveys, and pollsters were simply not weighting their samples by education. So they were overestimating the support for Hillary Clinton. Now, having said that, it was still off just by a little. I don't want to sound too defensive of the polling history, but so it wasn't as bad as many people make it out to be. What turned out to be bad is they were wrong by a small amount in the wrong direction. And we had Trump winning by a very, very narrow margin. So this year, things have changed a little bit. First of all, I've just noticed as an observer of politics, there's been so much more emphasis on state polls than what we saw in 2016. It seems as though people have really, they're kind of traumatized from that experience. And most pundits, most survey researchers, most commentators and reporters really do seem to be focused more on the battleground states than what we saw in 2016. And of course, people are trying to weight by education now, like really trying to get that weighting down to try to figure out exactly what the voting public is going to do, which is a hard thing to do. I mean, polls are great at telling us what people think. It's really hard to predict what somebody's actually going to do behaviorally. But I think that 2020, I trust the polls. I really do. I mean, I think survey researchers know what they're doing, and you can tell because a lot of these battleground state polls are exceptionally close.
Well, and in 2016, the polls didn't account for the Electoral College. As you said, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but the Trump campaign worked the system and won the Electoral College votes, and the polls don't account for that.
Right. I mean, in order to account for that, you have to know exactly which state each respondent is coming from, and you have to have a large enough sample size per state. Now, it doesn't make sense to do that on a national level. It would just be a massive sample. And the fact is most states are pretty safe. But what we've seen in 2020 is a greater investment in these battleground states. more surveys, bigger surveys coming out of places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, and even places this year like Arizona.
You and I have talked about this before, but not all 165 people who are joining us on this have heard this discussion, and that's about voting blocks. We've heard, I know I've heard the last few cycles, this is the year that the Latino vote comes through. We heard about soccer moms. We've heard about, all these different groups. Do voting blocks like that actually exist, or is that just something we in the media, maybe you in political science and campaigns, just make up?
The only voting blocks that are reliable voting blocks are Democrats and Republicans. Those are voting blocks, and you can rely on those voting blocks to behave pretty monolithically when it comes to politics. I don't know if there's another voting bloc out there that I would argue is really politically homogenous. A lot is made of the gender gap, which is the tendency for women to support the Democratic Party at higher rates than men. And that is absolutely the case. However, if you look at white women consistently support the Republican Party, and that has been true for decades. The reason we see this big gender gap in favor of the Democratic Party largely comes from non-white women who are overwhelmingly supportive of Democrats. Now, one bit of trouble that Trump seems to be in this year is he seems to really be losing the white women. Right now, it looks like white women actually favor Biden by just a couple percentage points, and that's really new. But what we generally see is, women are pretty politically heterogeneous. It's hard to predict somebody's vote choice based on their gender. You mentioned the Latino voting bloc. It's true that, Latino voters tend to support Democrats, but about 2/3 of them tend to vote for Democrats. About 1/3 tend to vote for the Republicans. And, Latinos are the fastest growing proportion of the American electorate. 1/3 of Latino voters, that's a lot of voters. So, we've seen both Donald Trump and Joe Biden make explicit appeals to Latino voters here in Arizona because they both know that they can make inroads with Latino voters, many of whom tend to be really socially conservative, for example, and that tends to align with Donald Trump. Latino voters have really heterogeneous views on immigration as well. So, I think that's another voting bloc that shouldn't necessarily be seen as such. And then, of course, another voting bloc that people tend to talk about are independents, as though independents are sort of this monolithic bloc, all of whom prefer third candidates. And in my own work, I found that's not at all the case. The vast majority of independents do support one of the two major parties. They've voted for that major party consistently, and they'd almost never vote for the other major party. Now, independents tend to be about split, about even, depending on which state you're looking at which time period you're looking at. So, sometimes I'll have people ask me, well, isn't it, given how many independents there are in Arizona, 40% or 35%, why don't we just have a third party that can come and sweep up all those independents? Well, those independents are really heterogeneous. About half of them are liberal and about half of them are conservative. It's not easy to unite such an ideologically diverse group. So, it's really hard to guess somebody's vote based on their demographics. The only thing that I would rely on is their party ID, because that's pretty predictive.
When I was in Florida, and I like to point this out to people now when they talk about the Latino vote, South Florida has a heavy Cuban American population. They tend to vote Republican. Central Florida has a lot of Puerto Ricans who tend to vote Democratic, at least in Central Florida. All Latinos. And then you get people from other South American countries and things like that in Florida. It's all over the board.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see there are obviously trends. Young people tend to vote for the Democrats. That's pretty consistent over time. Another bit of trouble that I think Trump is getting himself into here in Arizona and also in a state like Florida is that voters over the age of 65 very reliably break for the Republicans. And that is also something we're seeing shift this year. The polling that I'm seeing is showing Trump and Biden almost tied even among voters over the age of 65. To me, that's, for me, I think the most surprising story coming out of the election this year, the degree to which Trump is losing support among this voting bloc who used to be so reliably Republican. People are speculating that it's largely driven by Trump's response to the coronavirus. Especially lately, he's been pretty casual in his rhetoric toward the virus, talking about how he had the virus and you just need to go out and get it. Seniors aren't really into that message. That's not really working for them. And I think that's kind of a big part of the reason why Donald Trump is losing this bloc that used to just be so reliably conservative.
Is that the bloc that could make a difference for Joe Biden because that bloc was so reliably conservative, and maybe it's not the soccer moms as it has been in past elections?
Yeah, I mean, the shifts that we're seeing here in Arizona specifically would be, I think, senior citizens. We have a large proportion of senior citizens in Arizona who participate in the elections, and if Trump is losing support among them, that is chipping away at his, the safety he once felt in Arizona. I think also white women, especially suburban voters in Maricopa County, who have really lost enthusiasm for Trump. And I think that young people here in Arizona are remaining really, really highly supportive of the Democrats, and there's a huge get out the vote effort here. So, these trends that we're seeing, as I mentioned, they kind of make sense over time that Arizona would move purple. Trump is hastening that trend. I think that we are getting closer to blue this year because of how Trump has handled a lot of these issues that are so important to key voting groups in Arizona.
I know talking to Democrats, there's always the criticism of the president with the name calling and things like that. But let's be honest, it's nothing new. One of my favorite quotes about name calling and things like that comes from 1950. A U.S. Senate race, George Smathers versus Claude Pepper, where Smathers said, are you aware that Claude Pepper is known all over Washington as a shameless extrovert? Not only that, but this man is reliably reported to practice nepotism with his sister-in-law and has a sister who was once a thespian in wicked New York.
Ouch.
Worst of all, it's an established fact that Mr. Pepper, before his marriage, habitually practiced celibacy.
Wow.
Yeah, Pepper went on to lose that race, and George Smathers eventually said, I never said it, that was made up, fake news. But we've had this for a long time.
Oh yeah, I was just talking with my students the other day about negative ads, and I was showing them some examples just like that of negative ads from the early 20th century, and it's been going on for a long time. Absolutely, politics has never been a particularly friendly industry. I do think what has changed is the extent to which Democrats and Republicans no longer are willing to compromise in Washington, or at least to publicly compromise. It actually really infuriates partisans lately to see, for example, Senator Feinstein hugging Senator Graham after the Supreme Court hearings. Those kind of gestures are not really working for Americans anymore because they see so much unwillingness to work across the aisle when it comes to policies, and that's what really, really bothers them. I think the kind of language we saw in the presidential debate, the first presidential debate between Trump and Biden, that is new. I mean, disagreeing and name calling to a certain extent has always existed, but just the chaotic fighting, that has certainly increased over time. And I actually had a few research assistants who were coding all of the presidential debates over the past several decades to look for the percentage of words in each debate that convey conflict, or that convey insurmountable conflict, really. So conflict that Democrats, Republicans are never going to be able to work over. And that has increased exponentially. And people don't really like that. I mean, I think Trump and Biden really got it together in their second debate, where they were actually able to disagree in more of a coherent way. But the level of just sort of the vitriol, that's what's become new. And I think that's what people really dislike.
So Biden's response, would you just shut up, man? In the first one, probably, maybe it played well with his supporters, but those middle voters, again, it may not have.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think that kind of language is maybe effective at generating enthusiasm among the people who already loved you, or at least among the people who already hated the other guy. But, when there are people who they maybe think they know who they want to vote for, but they're frankly not sure if they're going to vote at all, that kind of stuff doesn't really help. And that's sort of the kind of thing that's just going to keep people at home. And I think the candidates both realized that when the second debate came around. And that's something I think Kelly did really well during the senatorial debate. I mean, Martha McSally spent that whole debate referring to him as counterfeit Kelly and sort of trying to vilify him, or at least to she was really aggressive with the ad hominem attacks. And Mark Kelly was really disciplined in not responding to that. And I think that actually worked really to his advantage, especially in a place like Arizona that values moderate candidates so much.
We saw 4 years ago, then candidate Trump, making up nicknames and not positive ones for his various, opponents in the Republican primary. And of course, Hillary Clinton. We've seen that, as you mentioned, Martha McSally going after Mark Kelly as counterfeit Kelly. are we going to see that drop off if Trump loses? Will candidates say, oh, maybe it worked once, but maybe not again? Or is this something, it's here to stay, or at least for a while?
Yeah, there was so many things were unique about the 2016 election. I think it would be unfortunate for a candidate to see Trump's language as what it was that won him that election. So first of all, he won by such a tiny margin that, very few things would have had to be different for that election to have gone the other way. He won by, what is ultimately a handful of votes in 3 states. So, I wouldn't say he did anything to really dominate with votes. There was a lot happening in 2016. Hillary Clinton would have been the most disliked presidential nominee in history if it were not for Donald Trump, who was slightly more disliked. So, the Democrats had a candidate that, for a variety of reasons, was not generating enthusiasm. Americans really value sort of this post-partisan, anti-establishment kind of narrative that Trump really pulled off. He presented himself as someone who was not from Washington, who wasn't from the Beltway, who was, he really tried to actually sell himself as kind of like this independent sort of guy. I think that worked really well. And then frankly, he drummed up a lot of, xenophobic feelings that a lot of Americans had been feeling. And I think that drove their votes to a large extent. So I don't know if it was his negative language that really helped him. And I don't know if it would really help any other candidate to that same extent. At least we haven't seen it work in any other case.
When we look at 2020 and history looks at 2020, they'll of course talk about this campaign, but the name of the chapter is going to be COVID, or the name of the books. Yeah. How has COVID, beyond the obvious, affected this campaign year on all levels, but especially the presidential level?
I mean, I don't think there's a single dimension of the presidential campaign that has not been impacted by COVID. First of all, the way that campaigning can occur has changed. Candidates have to limit their travel, and when they don't limit their travel, with rallies like Trump is doing, they're heavily criticized, they're heavily scrutinized. So the campaigning in and of itself becomes a topic of discussion and of scrutiny. Then, of course, we've seen COVID overtake every other issue as the most important issue in Americans' minds, regardless of whether you are a Republican. Coronavirus is an incredibly important issue, and there's so many things about it. I mean, some people are concerned about the public health consequences. Some people are concerned about the economy. Others are concerned about the fact that their kids aren't back in school yet. So, no matter what it is, you can pick your poison. Coronavirus just encompasses a lot of new issues that neither of these campaigns were fully prepared to deal with. Now, this really works to Biden's advantage because the state of America right now is under the Trump regime, and people are not satisfied with how this country has handled the coronavirus crisis. They are not satisfied with the economic fallout and the lack of support for families who have lost incomes since coronavirus hit.
It seems like in many ways, though, the coronavirus has been politicized, especially in this election year. Have we ever seen a disease be politicized like this, or maybe it's just bad luck timing?
Well, one thing that I think I really, would remind people of is that at the mass level, when we look at voters and residents of the United States, Democrats and Republicans aren't actually dealing with it that differently. So, more Democrats are wearing masks, more Democrats want masks to be mandated, but a substantial majority of Republicans do too. So I think there's actually much more unity among the mass public than what we saw, especially initially at the elite level. Today, Republican leaders are much more outwardly cautious about COVID than they were at the beginning. Donald Trump, of course, being an exception. So, I think the polarization that we talk about a lot when it comes to the pandemic is a little bit overblown. I think it exists absolutely at the elite level, but among the mass public, it hasn't been that dramatic. Now, in some of my work, what I've actually found is that as cases increase in particular counties, the most polarized Democrats and Republicans actually start to move a lot closer together. That's largely because Republicans become more concerned about it, whereas Democrats were always kind of on high alert. So, we do see a little more bipartisanship at the mass level as cases increase. And unfortunately, cases are increasing in a lot of counties. Maricopa County, of course, was a hotspot, a national hotspot, maybe a global hotspot over the summer. So that actually probably hurt Trump a lot in June, July.
How much is the news of the day affecting this race? It sometimes seems like the news of the day just doesn't matter for these candidates. They have their messages and often, as you said, tied to COVID, and off they go.
I mean, there's so much news every day. We've talked about this before, but October was 100 days long, 1,000 days long. I mean, it was in October that Donald Trump actually got COVID. That feels like I don't even remember that anymore. And, I think that this whole election cycle has been so confusing to people. The impeachment was supposed to be a big issue in the campaign. That was so long ago at this point. I don't think anybody has the time to think about it. So, the news of the day at this point, the fact is we're in a really unfortunate and a really sad situation in the US where we've lost a lot of income. A lot of people have lost their jobs, particularly women. I mean, women have been particularly hard hit by this economic recession, with kids in school who need to have their remote learning overseen by somebody. So, I wish voters I think voters wish that they could focus on the news of the day. That would be like a nice luxury at this point. But the fact of the matter is coronavirus has just upended everybody's lives. And that's kind of the only thing people can afford to think about right now.
I saw a pundit put out this weekend, and I want to see what you think about it, that when it comes to news of the day, specifically the new justice on the Supreme Court, Justice Barrett, that actually gives an excuse to some conservative voters, evangelical voters who would normally support President Trump because they want the people like Justice Barrett on the court, an ability to walk away and say, nope, I don't have to vote for him now. I don't have to vote at all. Is that wishful thinking on the part of a pundit, or is that a possible reality?
I would err on wishful thinking. I mean, I understand the logic there. And I think that, some people speculated that Trump might intentionally withhold that nominee until after the election so he could be sure that the real social conservatives show up to vote. But Trump, while he has appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, and, it's always possible he could have more in the next 4 years if he were reelected, he's done a really effective job of appointing a lot of judges at every level here in the United States. I mean, he has appointed so many circuit level judges. He has really changed the partisan composition of the courts here in the United States. So I think, people see that he's done that, and they're looking forward to more of that over the next 4 years. As I've said, there's a lot of people who don't necessarily support him personally, and they may not even necessarily support a lot of his policies, but they do support the work that he is doing to make courts here in the United States conservative, and he's done it very effectively.
One of the things also he's done effectively is use social media, especially Twitter. We heard, 4 years ago, 8 years ago, that President Obama was the first social media candidate because he really got Facebook going for his campaign. Donald Trump has taken that to a whole new level with Twitter. After 2020, is that here to stay? Is that the new way of campaigning because people can get around me as a member of the media?
Yeah, Twitter's been sort of a blessing and a curse for Donald Trump, because on one hand, when you ask Republicans about it, most of them say they don't pay attention to what he is on Twitter and they don't like it. A lot of Republicans will tell you in polls, I wish he weren't on Twitter so much. I hate his personality on Twitter. I support the guy's policies. I'm a conservative, but I can't stand Twitter. But on the other hand, it's a really powerful way, not only for him to communicate with voters, but also for him to sort of set the agenda for what media are talking about. Sometimes you'll watch news, cable news, and they'll have a breaking news chyron because Trump has released a new tweet that they need to talk about. So I think other candidates have used it. I think Howard Dean was probably the first candidate who really started to make use of the internet in terms of reaching voters. And we have seen it increase over time. Absolutely, Trump has brought it to whole new levels. And I think he's found something very effective about it. He can change what's happening on the news. He can set the media agenda. Even if voters don't necessarily like it, it's really effective for him at dominating the narrative and changing what people are talking about. So absolutely, I think that candidates are going to use it. We've seen Joe Biden using it throughout the campaign. Candidates at lower levels, Alexandria Cortez has been using it. A lot of candidates and sitting politicians who really want to reach voters have found it's a really useful strategy. And I think it's something that we can expect to stick around for a long time.
And it's cheap. You can reach a lot of people, and you don't have to buy time in an expensive media market like Maricopa County or New York City or wherever.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always going to be people that you're not going to reach. I think for reaching voters, I don't know if it's the most effective way, because there are lots of people who aren't on Twitter, who are relying on, what they're seeing in newspaper ads, what they're seeing on TV, what they hear on the radio. So that's not going to go away. But it is a really cheap way of getting through to a substantial number of voters and to changing what media are talking about. Journalists are following Twitter and they're reporting on what Trump is saying. I mean, a lot of people aren't on Twitter, but they still know what he said on Twitter because they heard about it on the radio.
As I like to say, I get my daily assignment, 200 some odd characters at a time from the president every morning.
Well, Pew just recently showed that 90%, that 10% of social media users post 90% of the content. So, what we see on social media are ideologically extreme and really heavily actively engaged voters. It's not really a representative look at what Americans are generally thinking. And I don't know if it's really a representative look at what's going on in Washington either. But, we see the loudest, most extreme, most shocking headlines, and those can really set the agenda.
Both Joe Biden and Mark Kelly here in Arizona have consistently outraised their opponents, President Trump and Martha McSally. If Republicans win those races nationally or here in Arizona, does that take the old adage that fundraising equals votes and throw it out the window?
Well, Clinton outraised Trump in 2016. So, there's exceptions to every rule, but I do think that what we're looking at in Arizona are challengers raising a lot of money to go up against an incumbent. So Trump and McSally already have the benefit here in Arizona of being incumbents. Although McSally wasn't technically elected, she was appointed, but they are still here. They are the incumbents. People know who they are. There are always voters who, when they don't know what to do, maybe they'll feel that it's best just not to switch. Let's just stay the course. So in a sense, we might expect that a challenger would have to increase their funds quite a bit in order to unseat somebody. But, this is just an unusual case. We are in such a tight race and it's such an important race. The amount of money that has been spent this year, I mean, I've heard it's exceeded $1 billion at this point, with most of that money being spent in battleground states. So, when you're looking at that amount of money being spent, I don't even know if we can start to draw comparisons.
What do people remember about campaigns? The average voter, I'm not necessarily talking about people like you or me who enjoy watching these things go through, but what do they remember? Do they remember what the candidate says he or she will do, or what she or he did, or is it they remember what the candidate they're supporting paints their opponent as doing if elected? What do people remember?
Well, first of all, I think I would quibble with the fact that I'm enjoying watching this at this point. Maybe I enjoyed it for a bit, but at this point, it's getting a little excessive. Generally, when voters are making up their minds about whether to vote, they think about whether or not they are satisfied with how things are going in their lives. Now, we know that Democrats and Republicans here in the US are pretty unlikely to switch their vote. It does happen. And every time I say this, I get somebody emailing or calling me, telling me that they are in fact one of the voters who has switched their votes. It does happen, but it's unusual. Most Democrats are, hesitant to vote for a Republican, and most Republicans feel the same way about voting for a Democrat. What voters are trying to decide is whether it's worth it to actually vote, to, mail in their ballot, to show up at the polls, especially in the middle of a public health crisis like we're in right now. And, they think about their lives right now. Do I have more money than I did last year? Are we healthier? Do we have health insurance? How are my job prospects looking? What's the value of my house? What's the price of gas? These are the kinds of things that people are really good at figuring out. You don't have to have a lot of sophisticated political knowledge to figure out whether government is working for you. Those are the kinds of things you can see, in the price of groceries and the price of gas, and whether or not you're happy with your kids' class sizes. So that's what people are going to be thinking about. Now, the campaign is obviously helpful. It can provide cues, it can provide information to people as to, what the candidates are going to do going forward. But really what we're seeing now, especially in such a polarized election, are two candidates just trying to encourage the people who already like them to show up and vote. Even if I wasn't your number one choice, you're going to have to come out and vote for me because the other guy is not working for you. That is the kind of message that we're really seeing in these final days.
We've spent just about this whole hour talking about two races, mainly just one, the president and the U.S. Senate. When we go down ballot, we have a new county recorder will be elected because the Pima County recorder is retiring. There are so many races like that. We have legislative races. We have U.S. House races in Arizona that nobody's talking about. Are those going to be totally influenced by what happens at the top of the ticket? Or will Arizonans be Arizonans and still split ticket as they go down the ballot?
Arizonans are pretty happy to split their ticket. I mean, I've had, internet journalists from other countries ask me whether it's likely that we'll have Arizonans voting for Biden, but still vote Republican at the state level. I actually think the opposite is more likely, in fact, that we will have people voting for Democrats at the state level and potentially supporting Trump at the national level. The state races here in Arizona have also seen a huge influx of money, way more donors than they've seen in the past, a ton of money being spent on what used to be pretty local elections and not a lot of interest, not a lot of enthusiasm. But this year, it's a real battle in Arizona. We also, of course, have ballot measures. The recreational marijuana is on the ballot. We have the measure to increase taxes in order to increase funding for public education. And I think one of the big impacts that those ballot measures are having, especially the education measure, is that the grassroots organizations involved in those measures are working so hard to get out the vote. So we are seeing mobilization efforts at every level in Arizona. The national campaigns, the Senate campaigns, and then our local campaigns are all really trying to get people to vote this year. And I think what we're going to see is, yes, a lot of split ticket voting and also just huge turnout. Because if one of these races is not motivating you to vote, the odds are another race is.
Do voters tend to vote the entire ballot, or do a lot of them just leave things open, the undervote, as it's technically called?
Well, there are, I don't know if you've already filled out your early ballot, but I did a couple of days ago or a couple of weeks ago, I can't remember anymore. And, there's so many positions on that ballot for people to fill out. One of the great things about early voting and mail-in voting is you can just sit down to your computer and Google every single one if you have the time. But yeah, absolutely. There's going to be people who will think more thoughtfully about the high information, high level races. So they may vote, for one party for president and the other party for the Senate race. But as they move down, that's when you start to see people just following their party cues, relying on their party identity to support the candidates who line up with them politically. And then, of course, you always have the nonpartisan races. For example, there's a lot of judges on the ballot this year in Arizona. There you'll see people, not filling things in or just voting to retain. But not always. It's a high mobilization going on this year in Arizona. And I think we're going to probably see some pretty informed voters trying to figure out how to split their tickets to best represent their policy preferences.
When it comes to voters, as we said up at the top of this, record numbers of people registered to vote in Arizona, Pima County, all over the country. People are excited or motivated or whatever the word is. We know there's going to be a drop off. There always is in a non-presidential election, but will it be a big drop off? And does some of that depend on what happens tomorrow or when we figure out what happened tomorrow?
Well, voting is habitual. So once you vote once, it becomes, for whatever reason, easier to do it again. People get in the habit of it. So if we are seeing a record number of first-time voters, which is what I think we will see this year, that could, impact Arizona's electorate for the long term. We could see people who decide maybe this is the year they'll bother to cast a ballot, and the sense of civic duty or whatever it is sticks with them, and they decide that they will continue to do it. So yeah, I think this could be a turning point in Arizona, especially among young voters, among voters that are being mobilized for the first time, Latino voters. There's huge mobilization efforts, and that could actually change the composite of the electorate and electoral outcomes in Arizona for decades.
Will we see the change in registration go back, where Republicans probably will maintain their registration lead, but maybe those non-party voters and Democrats flip back and forth, or maybe they stay very close here on out?
An interesting pattern that I've noticed in Arizona over the last several decades is that, the advantage that Republicans have in terms of their registration numbers has been pretty stable, although it has been narrowing. The advantage that Republicans have had in the presidential vote has been dropping pretty precipitously. So every year we're seeing around the same proportion of Arizonans identify as Republican, yet fewer and fewer actually vote for the Republican candidate. At some point, the registration numbers are going to have to follow those votes. We're going to start seeing fewer people identifying as Republicans, either switching their registration status or just the new entrants to Arizona, both from international and domestic migration, registering as Democrats. Because at this point, they are narrowing so much. I would expect in future years to see that gap narrow even more.
If Arizona goes blue tomorrow, and we have a win for Joe Biden. First time since Bill Clinton. I think it was 1996 that Arizona's gone Democratic. People wondered at the time, is this a new Arizona? And then, of course, Arizona went right back to Republican. Any prediction? Is this a new Arizona if Joe Biden wins, or we got to wait 4 years or 2 years till the gubernatorial race and see what happens?
Well, as I've said, I really think that this is a pretty predictable progression over time. In 2016, there was, a fair amount of speculation that Hillary Clinton would win. At that point in 2016, Arizona had been trending blue, not dramatically, but we saw a little bit over time. The proportion of Democrats was increasing. We know that Arizona had supported Bill Clinton in 92 and 96. So, I think that there has always been some speculation that Arizona is going to go blue. Many people have wondered why it didn't happen earlier, frankly, especially with the growth of urban areas. I mean, Maricopa County is home to 2/3 of the voters in Arizona, and that is a really quickly urbanizing county. That is the county that is really moving really quickly from red to blue. So I think the trends that we're seeing are things that have happened over time. I don't think it's an anomaly, and I think that they will continue.
All right. Well, we have basically reached the end of our time. Thank you so much.
It is always such a pleasure to speak with you, Chris. Thank you so much for doing this.
It's always fun. Like I said, I think people just got to listen in on many of the conversations we just kind of have on the side. And thank you to everybody for spending an hour with us. If you haven't voted, tomorrow's the day. Don't forget to vote. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.